What's happening, guys? Here we are again. 30 videos, 30 days, no edits, no do-overs. Just hit record, and as soon as you're done, post it. It's been fun. I've said that every time so far, but it has definitely been a learning experience. I've heard you guys, the folks that have my best interest in mind, telling me, hey, you got to do a better job. You got to pick a thumbnail, and you have to have a caption, and you have all these things, and that's what makes people want to click on it and watch it. I get it, man. I really do. And I'm not just being disrespectful to the folks who are trying to help me. I appreciate it, man. And I want all the help I can get. But that's not the spirit of the challenge. The challenge is none of that. Just video and upload and just do it. So that's where I'm at with that. But I do understand what you guys are trying to say and what you're trying to tell me. And I do appreciate it. I know that you just want to see me do well and put out some good stuff and have it be more appealing to a broader audience. And I really appreciate that, man. I do. I get it. I get where your heart's at, and I feel it, and thank you. So please don't ever not feel free to give me advice. I do hear it. It's just with this challenge, kind of got to stick with the rules. So I wanted to talk about my 1911's. That I've been using. I posted earlier a little bit about my dry fire, or about slide manipulation and dry firing with the 1911. Some days, for some reason, I just wake up and I'm like, man, I just want to just play around with the 1911 and just do a little dry fire. I thought I would tell you guys a little bit about them. So my 1911s are basically stock. They are Springfields. This is a TRP operator. And this other one right here is also an operator. It's just your standard Springfield Armory operator. These are empty. I was dry firing with them earlier today, so there's nothing in here. There's no ammo in this room. I keep this room cold. This is my training room, and there's nothing in here lethal by any means. And so anyway, I thought I would talk a little bit about these pistols for you guys. These things are basically bone stock. The only thing that I do different with these guns, if necessary, is I'll swap out the sights. You can see here, this is the 10-8 U-shaped rear with the stock, if I can get it there, with the stock front sight. It's just a tritium front sight, the 125 wide, which is a little too wide for me, but if you're a Glock shooter, then you're used to shooting those fatter front sights because of the screw that has to go up in there to hold the front sight on the Glocks. We have a whole generation of guys that have just figured out how to run a Glock with a fat front sight. Well, fat to me, right? 125 is pretty thick when you're used to running a .90 or something of that nature. So that's the sights. Those are the sights I run on this pistol. Everything else is basically stock. The grips are Via con Dios grips. I really like those. Tom Gibbons recommended those to me a long time ago. And I mean like 10, 15 years ago. And I've been running those on any 1911 I've had ever since then. The other thing that I do change, so I change the grips, I change the sights. And the other thing that I do was when I replace the recoil spring, I always run a 14-pound recoil spring. That's just the feel I like for my pistols. I don't like my pistols to be heavily sprung. It's just, I would rather eat the recoil and deal with it, and for what I like to do. Also, from a practical standpoint, having the lighter recoil spring in there makes it easier to do the one-handed manipulations if you have to like cycle the slide off of your vest, or for work purposes if you're in law enforcement, and or your holster, your leg, your belt, whatever. It just makes it easier to do that kind of stuff. It also makes it easier to do one-hand manipulations. So I like that. That's this one. This one is basically, that's about all there is to this 1911. Not a whole lot more to it. This one is the TRP. Same thing. I have the grips, the Via con Dios grips. If you can see those, they get pretty cool. Let me see if I can help with the focus there. Don't know if that's coming through or not. But we have standard trigger. Same with the other pistol. Standard trigger. Nothing fancy in there. I leave the triggers alone. The internals of both pistols have never been touched other than cleaning, because I just don't see a need. We're basically a 4.5, 5-pound trigger, a plunger type trigger. We'll talk about that in a second. So why mess with it? On this pistol, again, same thing. This pistol has the full length guide rod. You can kind of see that there. So not the old school 1911, but this has a full length guide rod. So a little different, adds a little weight to the front end. Again, 14-pound recoil spring. I did swap out the sights and threw in some Bomar. It's the Bomar sight cut. So threw in some Bomars, and the front sight, if you can see that, it's very narrow. So the front sight is a fiber optic. It is a point, I want to say this is a 0.90. So very thin, narrow front sight with a very bright fiber optic. So whenever I run iron sights on a pistol, I want them as non-obtrusive or unobtrusive, whichever word is correct there. I want them to be just not blocking my vision. I want to be able to see. I want to be, man, don't tell anybody, but even with iron sights, I shoot with a target focus, and the sights just come into play as I get on the trigger. Now, for holsters, or let's talk about magazines. For magazines, I run Wilson Chip McCormick Power Mags, so 8-rounders. I run those. These are training mags, so these are the mags that came with the gun. But I run the Chip McCormick Power Mags, 8-rounders. Love those. I've got dozens of those things, and I've never had a problem. Typically with a 1911, that is untouched. So if you just take it out of the box and just throw some grease on it and start running it, maybe swap the sights as needed if you need them. Sometimes with the stock sights are good enough, you know. But if you need the sights like I do, you swap the sights out and you just run the thing. Maybe put the grips on and you just keep burning it down. You don't really need to do a whole lot to keep this thing running, contrary to popular belief. The guns that break, whether they're Glocks, M&Ps, SIGs, whatever, the guns that I see break are the guns that people have done a lot of home school gunsmithing on. Even some of the guns that they've had like professionals, quote unquote, work on, and the guys just aren't good. They're not a good gunsmith. And as soon as they start running their gun, or particularly 1911s, they start running them hard in training, those things start going down. I've seen Glocks, especially Gucci'd out Glocks, like $3,000 Glocks, break just as much as I've seen the 1911s go down. So it's interesting, you know, might be a lesson in there about just keep it as close to stock as possible, minimal adjustments, minimal modifications, but only functional modifications. Now, why am I talking about that? One of the things that comes up whenever you talk about 1911s, whenever I see 1911s, I see people who have made mistakes. They've messed with the trigger. Now, lock this thing back. So there you go. You can see empty, you know, there's nothing in there. So this thing is empty. All right. Now, one of the cool things about the 1911, so I'm going to throw this empty mag back in there. Let sight go forward. Safety is on. One of the things about the Glock trigger, or the Glock, oh man. Ugh. Colonel Cooper is going to come down and hit me in the head with this thing. One of the things about the 1911 trigger, well, actually the Glock trigger, let's talk about that first. Most triggers are like a pendulum. They do that, right? And the pivot point is up here. So the trigger does that motion. It pivots around a set point where the trigger pin is, or whatever it is. Even Berettas, as much as I love them, they still do that. They still pivot around that spot, around that area. So the advantage, one of the beautiful things about the 1911 trigger is it's a plunger. See, it pushes straight down. That whole trigger moves straight down. There's no pivot. So if you guys could see that, I'm sure a lot of you guys already know what I'm talking about, but that's it. I just push it straight down. So the trigger is a plunger. So it basically just presses straight back. There's no pivoting, swinging. There's no extra movement. All the movement goes straight into the trigger, or into the trigger bar, moving the trigger bar backwards against the sear, and allows the hammer to go forward, right? So it's very simple, very elegant design. And whether you're shooting a 1911, or I see the, like, you know, the kind of the cool thing now for folks is to run the 2011s and the 9mm 2011s. And I see a lot of guys that they're still, like, a good gun, a great trigger can make up for a lot of bad habits or issues that a shooter has. Shooting a revolver, shooting a Glock, or a pistol with a less than optimal trigger compared to a 1911. So there's some revolver triggers out there that are sweet. The Beretta 92 series guns on single action, those triggers are comparable to most 1911 triggers in my experience. But my point is just, make sure when you guys are running these guns, whether you're running the 1911 or the 2011, it's going to be the same thing. But you want to isolate your trigger finger. See how my finger is flat right there? I want to isolate that trigger finger so only that part of my finger is moving, and I'm feeling the entire face of the trigger. So right now I can feel the entire front of the trigger. So this entire face of the trigger right here, I can feel it. I'm not touching the pistol, the frame, anywhere else. Everything's on the trigger. So all of my energy is going straight into that trigger, straight back. So you can kind of see how my finger's laying across there. Whether you're running the 1911, the 2011, whatever, it's all going to be the same. The 2011 is just a 1911 with more capacity, whether you're running 40 or 38 Super, or there's even some 45 2011s out there that I've shot years ago that, yeah, difficult to run those guns, man. But but your higher end, you know, like the STI, the staccatos now, those pistols, those guys have it down. But the main thing is just making sure that you have good trigger finger control, you know, that you should have developed by shooting a less optimal trigger, like in a Glock. And some of those pistols, the triggers just aren't that great. But if you can manipulate those triggers well, and you figured out how to drive those triggers, when you come over to the 1911, just be conscious, or the 2011, just be conscious of keeping that good trigger discipline, because it's easy to get sloppy. And that's what I found when I went from running 1911s exclusively and 2011s. I was carrying a 1911 for work and then carrying a 2011 as part of a challenge from Todd Lewis Green, but also shooting a lot of 1911, just a lot of 1911 for a period of about 5 or 6 years, maybe a little longer than that. And what I found was that when I went to shoot Glocks, I developed some laziness in my trigger control. So just be aware of that. Not a big deal, but just something I ran into. And, you know, if you're going to carry a 2011 for the rest of your life, or a 1911 for the rest of your life, not a problem, right? But if you ever want to shoot during a class, if you're teaching, you have to demo with a student's gun, you want to represent well. So just be conscious of that. As far as gear goes, cool story. This is a keeper. So this is a keeper from Keeper's Concealment. This is the first 1911 holster he ever made. And he made it for me. He also, the first Beretta 92 holster that he ever made was for me. So that's kind of cool. He made this for me back in 2010, 2011, somewhere in there. Because there were no appendix in the waistband options really that I could find that were workable for the 1911 with a rail and all of that good stuff. So he made this for me. It still holds up well. It's still a good piece of gear. And yeah, it's very comfortable. Then the next one that I want to show you guys is what I'm using currently. This is from Dark Star Gear. And this is kind of cool. Tom made a holster that works for 2011s and 1911s, railed 1911s. So this holster will work for your 2011 if you're carrying one of those, or your 1911 that's got a rail. So I've been able to carry a 2011 that I have, and also my 1911s in this holster every day, very comfortably. Only modifications I did was I put a little bit of the felt from the other side of the Velcro, so not the hook side, but the felt side. Put a little bit of that on here. Didn't really need a pad, but I did wear it with a wedge a couple times. Didn't really feel like I needed it, so I got rid of that. But the felt definitely takes away some of the hot spots, some of the edges that you're going to run into with the polymer or Kydex holsters. So that's it, man. These are my 1911s. I really like these things. I have shot them a lot. I have no idea the round count on either of those two pistols. There's some wear and tear on them. Obviously, you can see, you know, the back of the beaver tail is worn. The safety's worn from just, you know, holster wear, I guess you could say. On this side, there's slide wear again on the from the holster, that kind of stuff. Yeah, these have been workhorses. So I like them. I recommend them. I don't really get into the whole thing about whatever. Look, I don't know what your fight will look like. I can't predict what you'll need, but I do know this: you're going to need something that works every time, and something that you can run with absolute confidence, knowing that you know how this thing works inside and out. You have lived with this thing in your hand as much as possible, day in and day out, to the point that wherever you look, it looks, so to speak, and you can put rounds on anything that you can see. And if you can answer those questions and you can do that, then you should carry that, whatever that might be. I've had students come in with 1911s and 8-round mags, or even 7-round mags, and they burned it down. They ran the whole class. Yeah, they had to stuff more mags. They had to charge their mags up more often. They had to hit reloads more often. But for them, their needs and their skills, it was a great choice. I've also had students run revolvers. So, hey man, just train. The way is always going to be in training. So that's it for this time. I'll see you guys tomorrow.